L'intento di questo video è di ristabilire un po' di verità storica sulla vicenda russa-ucraina.
The intent of this video is to re-establish some historical truth relating to the Russian-Ukrainian affair. We live within a one-way narrative, according to which Vladimir Putin is the only responsible party in the current situation. Putin, our media tells us, is a bloodthirsty dictator obsessed by the need to restore an empire that no longer exists, who won't think twice before invading, destroying, and killing multitudes in order to reach his goals. Putin must be stopped at all costs. However, if one thinks about it for a moment, this narrative can't stand as it is. Only in comic books do you find a villain who wakes up one morning and decides to conquer a world made up of good and innocent people. In the real world, things are a little more complicated, and the blame is never just on one side.
Il problema è che le nostre televisioni ci mostrano solo la guerra.
The problem today is that media only reports what's happening now, and never bothers to explain how we got to this point. It's like showing people the last 30 seconds of a movie and expect them to understand the entire plot. For them to fully grasp what's happening, one needs to show them the whole story, right from the start.
Allora noi ci proviamo.
And that's what we'll attempt to do. We'll summarize it, of course, but we will at least try to touch upon all the key points of the issue, after which everyone is free to draw his or her own conclusions.
I temi principali da tenere d'occhio sono due. Uno è
There are two main themes to keep an eye on here. One is internal to Ukraine. The other is external. The internal one deals with the history of the Ukrainian people and the profound ongoing internal divisions that had existed for over a century amongst pro-Russians and pro-Westerners. The other issue, as we mentioned, is external, and it deals with Ukraine's political position within a delicate international equilibrium. Side with Russia, remain independent, or join the West and down the road NATO as well? As far as internal affairs are concerned, let's remember that we are talking about a country with a population in excess of 44 million that is deeply divided by strong ethnic-linguistic differences. The western regions, highlighted in yellow, speak mainly Ukrainian, while the southeastern ones, marked in red, speak mainly Russian. Technically speaking, there is no clear-cut division amongst the regions, but rather a progressive transition from the former to the latter. In the western area called Galicia, pure Ukrainian is spoken. In the central regions, there is a mix of Ukrainian and Russian, while to the southeast, the Russian language prevails.
Ma ucraini e russi sono anche due etnie diverse.
Ukrainians and Russians are also two very different ethnic groups, and historically speaking, they never really got along. Generally, it's the Ukrainians, not all of them of course, but many, who deeply despise the Russians, a hatred that dates back to Stalin in the 1930s.
Dopo la rivoluzione russa
After the Russian Revolution in 1917, Ukraine was annexed to the Soviet Union, a transition to which most Ukrainians didn't take well. In fact, many joined the White Army to fight the Bolsheviks. But when the Russians won, the Ukraine found itself an unwilling part of the Soviet Union. And one of the things that most Ukrainians never accepted was Stalin's new policy, which centralized and distributed the country's resources to the Russians. During the infamous collectivization, small local farmers called the kulaki were forced to give their lands to the kolkhozes, large state organizations that managed agricultural assets. This meant that the Ukraine, a country whose primary resource was wheat, was to become, at its own expense, the Soviet Union's main supplier.
E visto che molti kulaki si rifiutavano di cedere i propri terreni allo Stato,
And when many kulaks refused to give up their land, Stalin, in 1932, decided to put an end to the problem and did it in his own very personal way. To punish the rebels, he created a real famine lasting several years and costing millions of Ukrainian lives. This tragedy is remembered by the Ukrainians with the name of Holodomor. Violent land confiscations and mass deportations to the Gulag emptied entire villages, and for those who resisted, the death penalty
chi
awaited.
non accettava gli ordini di Mosca. Ripeto, sono fatti di quasi 100 anni fa.
Of course, this happened nearly a century ago, but it is key to understanding how deeply rooted this hatred towards the Russians actually is.
E infatti, proprio negli anni 30,
During the 1930s, several pro-Nazi organizations were born in the Ukraine, but for obvious reasons had to remain under the radar during Stalin's rule. These organizations were mainly based in Galicia, the western region of the country.
la più importante di queste organizzazioni
One of the most important ones was the OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, founded in 1929. One of the most prominent leaders of the OUN was Stefan Bandera. Their symbol was a red and black flag. The red represented blood, the black, the earth.
anti-russo, anti-polacco e antisemita,
Anti-Russian, anti-Polish, and anti-Semitic, Bandera proclaimed the superiority and purity of the Ukrainian people, just as Nazis proclaimed the superiority and purity of the Aryan people. Even today, as we will see, Bandera is considered the most important symbol of Ukrainian nationalism.
quando nel 1941 le truppe di Hitler
When Hitler's troops launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941 to conquer Russia, they had to cross southern Ukraine to get to Stalingrad. As they reached western Ukraine, the Nazi troops were welcomed as liberators. As a result, the pro-Nazi organization surfaced, and many Ukrainian nationalists soon became Nazi collaborators. Entire divisions and battalions were formed by Ukrainian collaborators, the most important being the Galicia Division, which enlisted more than 80,000 Ukrainian collaborators.
Naturalmente, sotto i tedeschi, queste armate ebbero mano libera.
Under German control, these newly formed battalions had free rein and carried out ethnic cleansing almost everywhere. The most infamous of these incidents was the Babi Yar massacre near Kiev, where 33,000 Jews were exterminated in only 2 days by the Bandera-led OUN. Another massacre involved 37,000 Poles who were slaughtered in eastern Galicia by the death squads of Mykola Lebed.
Questa era l'aria che si respirava nell'Ucraina occidentale.
This is what took place in western Ukraine during the German invasion. But then, Hitler lost the war. The Ukraine was englobed in the Soviet bloc, and the pro-Nazi platoons had to once again go underground.
Ma non persero tutti i loro amici.
But they didn't lose all their friends. The Americans always showed great interest and foresight in rescuing Nazis that could one day prove their worth.
Che possono tornargli utili in futuro.
An example of this was Operation Paperclip, where 1,500 German scientists were assisted and protected in their flight to the States after the war ended.
E lo hanno fatto anche con i nazisti ucraini.
Another such operation involved the Ukrainian Nazis, amongst which Bandera himself. Bandera was flown to Munich in Germany, where he lived under a false identity until 1959, when he was finally tracked down and killed by KGB agents. Another Ukrainian Nazi who was aided by the CIA was Mykola Lebed, the perpetrator of various massacres of Poles. Lebed was taken directly to the U.S., where he lived peacefully until 1998, all the while under the CIA's protection.
Questa alleanza fra la CIA e i nazisti ucraini è molto importante e lo vedremo tornare.
This alliance between the CIA and the Ukrainian Nazis is very important, as we'll see later on.
Li utilizzavano come fonte.
The reason why the CIA formed an alliance with the Ukrainian Nazis is very simple. They used them as local informers.
Entriamo così nella guerra fredda.
We thus enter the Cold War, which spans from 1946 till the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. 45 years during which two opposing superpowers face each other along a line called the Iron Curtain. To the east, the Warsaw Pact, led by Moscow, and to the west, NATO, which obviously also includes Canada and the United States. To the north, Sweden and Finland are both neutral, just like Switzerland and Austria in Central Europe. Yugoslavia, even though it's considered part of the communist bloc, officially never joins the Warsaw Pact.
Nel periodo della guerra fredda sono due.
There are two incidents of interest which occurred during this time period. One took place in 1954, when Khrushchev, Stalin's successor, gave Crimea to Ukraine. The reasons for this gift have never been fully asserted. Some claim that Khrushchev, himself a Ukrainian, wanted to somehow amend the wounds to the Ukrainian people inflicted by Stalin. Some instead say he wanted to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the historic 1654 Pact of Friendship between Ukraine and Russia.
Insomma, di sicuro non si sa. Di fatto,
No one really knows how things went. But one thing is for sure. In 1954, Crimea became an integral part of the Ukraine, although still a part of the Soviet Union. However, the Sevastopol naval base, which is the headquarters of the Russian naval fleet in the Black Sea, remained under direct Russian control. The second important event occurred in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's summarize it briefly. In 1959, Castro led the Cuban Revolution, and the island became part of the Soviet bloc. In 1962, some American U-2 spy planes showed that construction of Russian-supplied nuclear missile ramps was underway on the island. As a result, President Kennedy made a risky but intelligent choice. Instead of privately dealing with the Russians, he went public and appeared on national television to tell the world what was happening.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
E una cosa era certa: Kennedy era assolutamente disposto a rischiare la terza guerra mondiale.
One thing is certain. Kennedy was willing to risk a third world war just to ensure himself that Cubans dismantled the launch pads. We know this from a recording of a phone conversation between Kennedy and his predecessor Eisenhower. Let's hear it.
We're not going to be in any position to carry out an invasion for some days because we have to move those troops around from San Diego, but we're going to do all those things.
Of course, from a military standpoint, that's a clean-cut thing to do now.
That's right.
Because you've made up your mind, you've got to get rid of this thing.
Right. General, what about if the Soviet Union, Khrushchev announces tomorrow, which I think he will, that if we attack Cuba, that it's going to be nuclear war? And what's your judgment as to the chances they'll fire these things off if we invade Cuba?
I don't believe it.
You don't think they will? In other words, you would take that risk if the situation seems bizarre.
As a matter of fact, what can you do?
Well, hang on tight.
Yes, sir.
Thanks a lot, General.
All right, thanks.
Quindi avete sentito? Kennedy era pronto a invadere Cuba e a rischiare uno scontro nucleare con la Russia.
It's clear beyond any reasonable doubt that in order to avoid the threat of nuclear missiles just 200 kilometers away from the American coast, Kennedy was ready and willing to invade Cuba, risking a nuclear war with Russia. Fortunately, history tells us that the Russians backed off and the Cuban missiles were dismantled. In exchange, Kennedy promised never to invade Cuba and quietly removed his missiles from Turkey, which were aimed at Russia, of course. That was the closest we ever came to an all-out nuclear war.
Nel 1989 crolla il muro di Berlino.
In 1989, the Berlin Wall came crumbling down. And over the course of a few years, so did the Soviet Union. One by one, all its satellite countries claimed their independence, as did the Ukraine in 1991.
E qui, con la caduta del muro, si pone un grosso problema, perché tutti si rendono conto che...
But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, a dilemma arose. What will happen now to NATO? Theoretically, being a defensive organization against the Warsaw Pact, which no longer exists, NATO has no reason to be. But instead of dismantling it, the US decides to keep it, since Russia is still considered a threat, even without its satellite countries. NATO will soon become the weapon America will employ to destroy Russia once and for all. Doing this, however, risks leading to major imbalances on the international stage. This article by Der Spiegel explains what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The first obstacle was the Eastern German region, originally part of the Warsaw Pact, which would be reuniting with the Western region, part of NATO. So for East Germany, it wasn't even a question of taking the intermediate step of independence before joining the West.
Diventando prima un paese indipendente.
They would become NATO allies overnight. The Russians, therefore, demanded guarantees that this type of transition would end with East Germany and that NATO expansion eastward wouldn't take place. In the Spiegel article, we read, in early February 1990, Genscher, the German foreign minister, and Baker, the American foreign minister, presented the idea in Moscow independently of one another. The German foreign minister assured the Kremlin that, for us, it is a certainty that NATO would not expand to the east, and that applies generally, clearly meaning beyond just East Germany. The American, for his part, offered ironclad guarantees that NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward. When Gorbachev said that NATO expansion was unacceptable, Baker responded, "We agree with that." U.S. President George H.W. Bush, for example, said, "We have no intention, even in our thoughts, to harm the Soviet Union in any fashion." French President François Mitterrand told Gorbachev that he was personally in favor of gradually dismantling the military blocs. NATO Secretary General Manfred Warner later expressed his clear opposition to the expansion of the Western Alliance. The message was clear. If Gorbachev were to provide his acquiescence for German reunification within NATO, the West would aim at establishing a Western security architecture that took Moscow's interests into account. And so, in 1991, Germany is reunited, with Berlin as its capital, and remains an integral part of NATO. The pact, verbal only, not written, is that NATO will not expand east.
Poi più avanti, molti dei partecipanti a questi incontri sarebbero...
But history has it that over the years, many of those who took part in these meetings would become somewhat forgetful, and many promises would soon be broken.
Il problema è che negli Stati Uniti, in quel periodo, i neocons stavano lentamente arrivando al potere.
The problem is that in the United States, the neocons are slowly gaining power. And along with them come their philosophy that sees them as the only dominant force in the 21st century, what they call the new American century.
Naturalmente, dal loro punto di vista,
of course, in order to be the only dominant force, Russia has to be erased permanently. In the famous document entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses, the neocons write, "The United States is the world's only superpower, combining preeminent military power, global technological leadership, and the world's largest economy. Moreover, America stands at the head of a system of alliances which includes the world's other leading democratic powers. At present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible." Then, but what should finally drive the size and character of our nuclear forces is not numerical parity with Russian capabilities, but maintaining American strategic superiority, and with that superiority, a capability to deter possible hostile coalitions of nuclear powers. U.S. nuclear superiority is nothing to be ashamed of. Rather, it will be an essential element in preserving American leadership in a more complex and chaotic world.
Sempre più caotico e complesso. Questa era la filosofia dominante negli Stati Uniti.
This is the predominant philosophy in the United States at the end of the 20th century, and it has nothing to do with safeguarding Russia's security. We want absolute control of the world, and now is the right time to take it. And they plainly state it, in black and white.
Naturalmente, non è che la Russia fosse passata di colpo.
Obviously, Russia hasn't gone from being an atomic superpower to a barren farmland with people armed with slingshots. Their nuclear arsenals are still intact and ready to go. Therefore, it's unthinkable to attack them militarily.
Bisognava trovare il modo di indebolirli piano piano dal punto di vista economico.
A way has to be devised to slowly and progressively weaken them economically. To achieve that, the U.S. has two plans. One is to force them to constantly increase their military spending. The other is to impose new economic sanctions whenever the possibility arises. To impose exorbitant military expenses, the Russians must be surrounded by enemy bases with missiles aimed at Moscow. This way, not only will they feel threatened physically, but at the same time, they'll be forced to spend an ever-growing amount of money to strengthen their security. This is what the neocons mean when they speak of maintaining American strategic superiority.
Continuare a piazzare sempre più missili?
Place more and more missiles in the surrounding countries to force the Russians to cater to their defense rather than their economy.
Infatti, a proposito di nero su bianco,
speaking of black and white, in 1997, Zbigniew Brzezinski publishes a book entitled The Grand Chessboard, detailing the American supremacy and its geostrategic imperatives.
nel quale viene delineata chiaramente la strategia futura degli Stati Uniti verso la Russia. Invogliare e portare dalla parte dell'Occidente.
The book explains how the U.S. plans to weaken Russia by gradually enticing ex-Warsaw Pact countries to join NATO, slowly tightening the noose around the Russians' neck.
Questa filosofia di provocare e far innervosire i russi.
This same philosophy is clearly expressed by an American senator back in 1997. His name is Joe Biden. Listen to him as he talks about provoking a vigorous and hostile reaction from the Russians, even if not military, while the U.S. pulls in the Baltic states one by one into NATO. And look at his grin while he says it.
I think the one place where the greatest consternation would be caused in the short term for admission, having nothing to do with the merit and preparedness of the country to come in, would be to admit the Baltic states now in terms of NATO-Russian, U.S.-Russian relations. And if there was ever anything that was going to tip the balance, were it to be tipped in terms of a vigorous and hostile reaction, I don't mean military, in Russia, it would be that.
E infatti, contrariamente agli impegni presi.
Needless to say, contrary to all the commitments made back in 1991 with Russia, Hungary, Poland, and the Czech Republic joined NATO in 1999. In 2004, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria also joined. The only country that's now missing to complete the plan is Ukraine. But lo and behold, what happens to Ukraine in 2004? Why, the First Color Revolution, financed by the United States, aimed at pulling this country as well into the Western sphere.
L'Ucraina, infatti, a partire dalla sua indipendenza nel.
Since its independence back in 1991, the Ukraine remained somewhat neutral, keeping good relations with both the Western world and Russia, never leaning too much in either direction. But in 2004, the country has its elections. The two main opponents are the pro-Russian Viktor Yanukovych and the pro-Western Viktor Yushchenko. Actually, Yushchenko is something more than just a pro-Western candidate. He is designated and supported by the United States. His wife, Katerina Yushchenko, worked in the White House with Ronald Reagan, then becoming a senior official in the U.S. Foreign Ministry. Thus, the elections have one candidate supported by the CIA, the other by the KGB. For the first time in history, the Ukraine becomes a battleground between Russia and the United States.
Come vedete dalla cartina,
As we can see from the map, the vote is a clear-cut division between opposing geographical areas. The northwest, with the capital Kiev, votes in favor of Yushchenko, while the southeast votes for Yanukovych, backed by Russia. The latter wins the elections, but someone is not pleased. In Kiev, people take to the streets, and that becomes known as the First Maidan Square of 2004, the so-called Orange Revolution.
dopo un mese, la Corte Suprema annulla il risultato elettorale e indice nuove.
After a month, the Supreme Court cancels the vote and issues a new one. This time the winner is Yushchenko, who's welcomed to Washington as a hero. Today, everyone knows that the Orange Revolution was the brainchild of the big minds in Washington, who also financed it. George Friedman, a famous American geopolitical analyst, openly admits it during his lectures.
The United States had staged a series of colored revolutions throughout the Russian periphery, one of which was in the Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. And the Russians saw in this Orange Revolution the intent of the Americans to destroy the Russian Federation. Why else would the United States be underwriting groups to demonstrate?
Quindi i russi sapevano benissimo che
The Russians know very well what's happening, but can only stand by and watch.
inizia infatti sotto i loro occhi
And right before everyone's eyes, as Putin later put it, the Nazification of Ukraine begins. Upon becoming president, Yushchenko appoints as Prime Minister Yulia Tymoshenko, a right-wing extremist who truly hates Russians. In the president's shadow, various far-right leaders also flourish, such as Arseny Yatsenyuk, Vitaly Klitschko of the ultra-nationalist Udar party, and Ole Tyanibok, a member of the neo-Nazi party called Svoboda.
Tenete presente questo trio.
Keep this trio in mind, as we'll see them later on in action. During his presidency, Viktor Yushchenko makes a highly significant gesture in favor of all Ukrainian Nazi sympathizers. He rehabilitates Stefan Bandera and even names him a national hero.
Завершення я хочу сказати про те, що чекали мільйони українських патріотів і багато років. Я підписав указ за незламність духу, відстоюванні національної ідеї, виявлені героїзм і самопожертву в боротьбі за незалежну українську державу, постановляю присвоїти звання Герой України з удостоєнням ордена держави Бандері Степану Андрійовичу. Слава Україні!
Poi però la nazificazione dell'Ucraina subisce una battuta d'arresto.
During the 2010 elections, however, the Nazification process in the Ukraine suffers a setback. Although Yushchenko has had full power for 6 years, he's unable to carry out the promised reforms. And this time around, his opponent, Russian-backed Yanukovych, is a clear-cut winner.
Qui inizia un periodo delicato.
Here begins a delicate period because the pro-Russian Yanukovych is still tempted by the offers coming from the West. The International Monetary Fund promises him large loans to enter Europe, but in return calls for reforms and social changes that will harm the lower classes. This is what they always do with poor countries. They show you the money, but in exchange they ask you to do some social butchery. It's Yanukovych himself who talks about it during an interview with Oliver Stone.
Поэтому у нас было два партнера. Прежде всего мы рассчитывали на Международный валютный фонд. Но Международный валютный фонд на протяжении года, когда мы вели переговоры, нам предлагал неприемлемые для нас варианты решений. Значительное поднятие тарифов для населения, прежде всего на энергоносители и на газ, то есть значительный рост расходов населения. При том, что доходы оставались прежние. Мы на это не пошли. Мы предложили другие варианты решения вопросов. Мы получили официальный отказ Международного валютного фонда в ноябре 2013 года. Оставалась Россия.
Dopo un lungo tira e molla, Yanukovych decide di non firmare.
After a heated debate, Yanukovych decides not to sign the economic agreement with Europe. This is the historical turning point, which determines everything that will happen over the next 8 years. Western media openly regrets the missed opportunity to lure the Ukraine into the Western orbit.
Ukraine had an historic opportunity this week to move toward full integration with the European Union. EU leaders wanted to seal an association agreement which would have drawn one of Europe's largest nations firmly into Brussels' orbit. But Ukraine's president walked away from the deal in favor of closer ties with Russia.
Preparations for the coup begin. Ukrainian MP Tsarov exposes to the parliament the Tech Camp operation, managed by the American Embassy in Kiev, to organize and lead the popular uprising through social media.
Которые предоставили убедительные свидетельства того, что на территории нашего государства при поддержке и при непосредственном участии посольства Соединенных Штатов Америки осуществляется проект Техкомп, в рамках которого ведется подготовка к разжиганию гражданской войны на Украине. Проект Техкомп направлен на подготовку специалистов по информационным войнам и дискредитации государственных институтов современных медиа, потенциальных революционеров для организации протестных действий, свержения государственного режима. Проект находится под патронатом и кураторством посла Соединенных Штатов в Украине Джеффри Пайета.
Siamo nel dicembre 2013.
It's December 2013, and the citizens of Kiev take to the streets to protest against the missed agreement with Europe. Initially, the protests are peaceful. Meanwhile, Victoria Nuland flies to Kiev to meet with President Yanukovych. Nuland is the key figure in the whole affair. Former U.S. ambassador for NATO under Bush, Victoria Nuland is married to one of the most important neocons, Robert Kagan. Kagan is one of the authors of the famous document, Rebuilding America's Defenses. Remember, we should maintain nuclear strategic superiority around the world.
È lui. Tanto per capire il
Just so we know who we're talking about, Kagan is known for a phrase that has become the neocon slogan. When you have a hammer, all problems start to look like nails. Back then, Nuland was a Deputy Secretary of State under John Kerry, with a special mandate for Eurasia. And here you have it, folks. The infiltration of the neocons into the American government. Simple, direct, and in plain sight.
Nel dicembre 2013, di fronte alla...
In December 2013, in front of the U.S.-Ukraine Association, Victoria Nuland tells of her meeting in Kiev with President Yanukovych. What she told him was basically this: we've been working for 5 years to bring Ukraine to the West, and we've already spent $5 billion. You must sign the agreement with Europe. Otherwise, there is no future for you.
I spent more than 2 hours with President Yanukovych. It was a tough conversation, but also a realistic one. The United States believes there is a way out for Ukraine, that it is still possible to save Ukraine's European future, and that is where we wanted to see the President lead his country. It would be a huge shame to see 5 years' worth of work and preparation go to waste if the AA is not signed in the near future. We've invested over $5 billion to assist Ukraine in these and other goals that will ensure a secure and prosperous and democratic Ukraine.
Ma Yanukovych, nonostante le pressioni dell'Occidente, non cede e si rifiuta di firmare l'accordo.
But Yanukovych, despite all these pressures, doesn't give up and refuses to sign the agreement with Europe. And thus, the Americans decide to get rid of him. The protests in Maidan Square, which had started peacefully, suddenly take a turn for the worse and become violent. Snipers begin targeting both protesters and the police, a typical tactic which creates panic, confusion, and anger.
From one of the upper windows of the hotel, a shot rang out. Up there, okay, yeah, our hotel. That window, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth row from the left, second from the top, one that was open.
From the very early morning, unidentified shooters opened fire on the protesters and on law enforcement. And this was a point of no return to Ukraine as we know it.
The protests quickly spiral out of control, and Maidan Square turns into a bloodbath with everyone shooting at everyone. Total chaos.
Dopo 3 mesi di rivolte,
after 3 months of riots, President Yanukovych is deposed and forced to leave the country seeking refuge in Russia. Petro Poroshenko will be elected in his place, with Yatsenyuk as prime minister obviously appreciated and approved by the West, and the coup is complete.
C'è però chi nega che questo sia stato...
However, some people deny that this was a coup d'etat orchestrated by the Americans and say no, it was a normal democratic process within the Ukraine. It's worth noting that no peaceful demonstration has ever by itself led to a government's overthrow. It always takes a spark, something that transforms a peaceful event into a tragic and more effective one. So let's take a step back and see who was in Maidan Square stirring the crowds against Yanukovych. Arseny Yatsenyuk of the Tymoshenko party, together with Vitaly Klitschko from Udar and Ole Tanyabuk from the Svoboda party.
E sono proprio questi tre personaggi.
Curiously, this threesome is the subject of a phone call that took place at that time between the American ambassador Pyatt and Victoria Nuland. This phone call, later known as Nulandgate, was obviously supposed to remain a secret, but someone made it public, generating profound embarrassment in the U.S. State Department.
Si sentono infatti chiaramente la Nuland e Pyatt.
During the call, Nuland and Pyatt are heard discussing about who will form the new Ukrainian government. They clearly talk about who can be part of the team and who can't. According to Nuland, Yatsenyuk can be prime minister, while neo-Nazis Klitschko and Taniebok, who are unpresentable, must remain on the sidelines and collaborate from the shadows.
So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
In terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff.
I think Yats is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Taniebok on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week.
Questa telefonata è diventata famosa anche perché
Another reason why this phone call becomes famous is due to Nuland's "fuck the EU" phrase, which follows her stating that this operation should be carried out by the UN.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly.
At the end of the phone call, Nuland confirms to Ambassador Pyatt that Vice President Biden is okay on the whole operation.
Sullivan's come back to me, VFR, saying, you need Biden, and I said probably tomorrow for an attaboy and to get the deets to stick. So
Okay.
Biden's willing.
Okay, great.
During the riots, Nuland makes sure to make her presence known by appearing in several town squares, always accompanied by Ambassador Pyatt, while bringing bread to the demonstrators.
Hello, how are you? Good to see you. We're here from America. Would you like some bread? Please take something. Please. Take something. Guys, are you hungry? No?
The United States stands with you in your search for justice, for human dignity, for security, for economic health, and for the European future that you have chosen and that you deserve.
Another figure who feels a great need to visit the Ukraine during this time is U.S. Senator John McCain.
I'm Senator John McCain, and it's always a pleasure to be back in Ukraine.
And McCain seems quite at ease while haranguing the crowds in the square as if he were on his home turf.
This is about the future you want for your country. This is about the future you deserve. Thank you. Thank you.
E guardate un po' chi c'è sul
And look who's on the stage next to John McCain. It's Ole Taniebok, leader of the Nazis' Svoboda Party. Remember him? The U.S. has kept good relations with the Ukrainian Nazis since the end of the war. And at long last, they've come in handy.
Ora qui non è che noi usiamo il termine nazista così.
Mind you, we're not using the term Nazi lightly here, just so that it's clear who we're dealing with. This is a post written by Taniebok, who appeared on the official Svoboda Party website.
Чтобы создать действительную украинскую Украину, физически ликвидировать всю русскоязычную интеллигенцию и всех украинофобов быстро, без суда и следствия, расстрелять. Реестр украинофобов на своем участке может составить любой член «Свободы», казнить всех членов антиукраинских партий и организаций, не только пророссийских, но и прорумынских, провенгерских, протатарских. Русскоязычная аморфная биомасса живых желудков – это стадо надо ликвидировать где-то на 5-6 миллионов особей.
Good for you, John McCain. That's how democracy is exported. And here is Nuland with her 3 jewels. Yatsenyuk, the extreme right's only presentable face, Klitschko of Udar, and Taniebok, the neo-Nazi who will do all the dirty work on the government's behalf. The same threesome already seen in Maidan Square. Quite a coincidence, huh? Klitschko is given his little prize and becomes mayor of Kiev. And again, who is right there ready to congratulate him for his election as mayor? Why, it's Victoria Nuland, of course.
He was fantastic.
È stato fantastico.
He was fantastic. Just think, the U.S. Deputy Foreign Minister congratulating the newly elected mayor of Kiev. Then, a peck on the cheek of Yatsenyuk, a handshake from Ambassador Pyatt, and the brand new U.S. conjured dream government is ready to go, with Poroshenko, a pro-American, as president. At this point, Yatsenyuk sets off to try and get the Ukraine to join NATO. But let's pause our story for a moment. Remember, we're in 2014. Now, let's first take a look at what happens in the Ukraine right after the coup. After the victory, the Nazification of Ukraine continues, and all-out hatred for the Russians explodes with no restraints as Tyanibok and his friends begin wreaking havoc. In several Ukrainian cities, Lenin statues are demolished. Paramilitary organizations of clear Nazi inspiration come out into the open. The most active is Pravy Sector, Right Sector, which dusts off the old red and black flag of the first Ukrainian Nazis. Actual battalions make their appearance patrolling the streets day and night with the self-appointed task of maintaining order, since, as they say, the police don't care enough.
К сожалению, полиция не справляется со всеми проблемами, которые существуют в нашей стране. Естественно, мы, как патриоты Украины, возлагаем эти функции на себя.
The infamous Azov Battalion is born, a paramilitary organization of clear Nazi inspiration, which in 2014 is incorporated directly into the Ukrainian National Guard by Interior Minister Avakov. The infamous Nazi-inspired torchlight processions return to town squares. Naturally, Stefan Bandera's picture stands out as he's celebrated as a national hero.
Ukrainian
World War II Nazis receive special reburial ceremonies while hailed as heroes by Ukrainian soldiers wearing Nazi uniforms.
Ethnic Ukrainian nationalists wore helmets with swastikas and uniforms marked with Third Reich eagles during the service for 16 members of the SS Division Galicia. The ceremony took place in the western Lviv province. Some veterans were present. During a salute over the grave, costumed reenactors used wartime-era rifles to fire a salute as their leader gave commands in German.
Ukrainian children are very reminiscent of the Jugendbund, the Nazi youth. In demonstrations, Ukrainian kids kick the Russian flag. In schools, children are taught that peers bearing a Russian nickname are not real Ukrainians, and that they must be segregated and sent home.
Це також не український хлопчик. Він мав би звідси забратися або навчитися, як українською мовою правильно називатися.
Others are taught to say, "We will slaughter the Russians," and to do the Nazi salute.
Мариночка, ти будеш різати русню?
Да.
Що ти будеш робити?
Русню різати! Я буду різати русню! Я буду різати русню!
Times get tough for Russians living in the Ukraine. Listen to President Poroshenko's program for his Russian-speaking fellow citizens.
У нас работа будет, у них немає.
У нас работа будет, у них нет. У нас пенсии будут, у них нет. У нас поддержка людей, детей и пенсионеров будет, а у них нет. У нас дети пойдут в школы и детские сады, а у них они будут сидеть по подвалам, потому что они ничего не умеют делать. Вот так, именно так мы выиграем эту войну.
And this is Julia Tymoshenko, who returns to the streets after a 3-year sentence for power abuse. These are her humanitarian programs for her Russian fellow citizens.
Брать оружие в руки и идти мочить этих, кацапов чертовых, вместе с их руководителем. Я подниму весь мир, как только смогу, для того, чтобы, просто от этой России не осталось даже выжженного поля. Их расстреливать из атомного оружия.
This is the atmosphere in Kiev after the Maidan coup.
A quel punto i russi della Crimea, che sono il 90%.
When the Russians living in Crimea, who make up 98% of the population in that region, realize what's going on, they choose to separate from Ukraine and join Russia. Let's remember that Crimea has always been Russian, but it was donated by Khrushchev to the Ukraine for reasons unknown. In March 2014, after Russian troops take control of Crimea, the population holds a referendum to reject the authority of the illegal government in Kiev and return to Russia. The referendum takes place peacefully, and the yes wins with overwhelming percentages. 96.77% of voters choose to return to Russia. This is a resident of Sevastopol after the vote.
Сегодня, как у всех севастопольцев, ощущение праздника. Праздника воссоединения с нашей истинной родиной России. В принципе, мы никогда от нее и не отходили, и себя так же и чувствовали.
Questa mossa ovviamente fa imbestialire gli occidentali.
This move obviously infuriates Westerners who accuse Putin of setting up a farce referendum to carry out a de facto annexation. To see what the Crimean population really wanted, however, all one has to do is look at the pro-Russian demonstrations that took place during those days.
Since the beginning of the Russian invasion, this is the day these people have been waiting for. They've just announced that enough people have voted for the referendum to count, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind here that the vote has been for joining Russia.
E qui, dopo il referendum, succede una cosa pazzesca. Cioè l'Occidente capovolge.
At this point, a crazy thing happens. The West totally flips the narrative of the two events. What was without a doubt a coup in Kiev is passed off as a legitimate expression of self-determination. And what was a real exercise in self-determination, namely the Crimean referendum, doesn't get recognized by the Western powers. During the same press conference, Obama manages to simultaneously affirm the right to self-determination of the Ukrainians in Kiev, but denies the rights of Crimea to separate.
As I told President Putin yesterday, the referendum in Crimea was a clear violation of Ukrainian constitutions and international law, and it will not be recognized by the international community. As I told Prime Minister Yatsenyuk last week, the United States stands with the people of Ukraine and their right to determine their own destiny.
Cioè, gli ucraini di Kiev, siccome vengono verso di noi, hanno il diritto di autodeterminarsi. Gli ucraini di Crimea, che invece vogliono andare verso Putin, non ce l'hanno.
In other words, those Ukrainians who wish to join the Western world have a right to self-determine, but those who instead wish to embrace Putin don't. Think about it if the situation had been reversed. That is, if the Russians had organized the coup in Kiev to overthrow a pro-American government and set up a pro-Russian one, and then Crimea had chosen to break away from Ukraine to join NATO. Obama would have said, "We do not recognize the illegal Russian coup in Kiev, while we do welcome the entry into NATO of Crimea, which has exercised its God-given right to self-determination." He would have easily flipped the terms and no one would have said a thing. Unfortunately, this is the hypocrisy in which we live today. Values are flaunted based on convenience. In any case, the Crimean Russians want to return to Russia, and they do. And the proof they were right comes only a few weeks later.
Il 2 di maggio, durante una serie di manifestazioni che si svolgono
On May 2nd, during a demonstration in Odessa against the Kiev government, squadrons of Nazi thugs decide to teach a lesson to Russians living in Odessa. They threaten the police, saying, "Since you're not breaking up the demonstration, we will do it." After which, they chase away the agents who realize they're no longer welcome in the square. Once they've taken control of the city, the squadrons head to Kulikovo Square, where the inhabitants of Odessa are protesting against the Kiev government. What follows has gone down in history as the Odessa Massacre. Protesters are attacked by Pravi sector thugs and are forced to take refuge inside the Union House located in the square. But the building turns out to be a death trap. Once inside, the demonstrators are besieged, and the attackers throw firebombs at the building, setting it on fire. Those seeking refuge on the ledges become easy targets for the attackers. Others are enticed to jump to their death, and after falling, they're shot. The thugs finally enter the building and massacre everyone still found alive. There are countless photos, which we won't show you, of charred corpses lying all over the place. Others half-charred. This means that they did not die in the fire, but were set on fire while still alive. Other images show a pregnant woman tied to a table and strangled to death with a wire.
Il bilancio finale è di una cinquantina di morti fra I civili di Odessa.
The final toll is about 50 dead. The next day, Pravi sector Nazis celebrate the Odessa massacre as another proud moment in their nation's history. The Russian population in the eastern regions of Lugansk and Donetsk, the so-called Donbass, also reject the authority of the newly formed government and call for their own referendum to break away from Kiev and become an independent republic.
Я хочу поддержать свой народ. Мы против этой банды, мы против фашизма. Я хочу действительно, чтобы это был таможенный союз. Нас не слышит Киев, нас не слышит Евросоюз.
Our people want to live quietly and peacefully without the junta who seized power in Kiev, and so that we're not under America and the West. We don't want to be their slaves. We want to be part of Russia.
But before they can even count the votes, the tanks from Kiev are already on their way.
Едут к нам в Мариуполь. Пидорасы, сука. Ля, сколько их, ничего себе. Так, блядь, что там, ящики какие-то, блядь, везут, да? Ракеты, что ли? О, Катюша, блядь, ебаные, сука. Это град, блядь, ебаный. Че град, че Катюша, разница, блядь. А что не собираются, сука, уебки, блядь?
Anche i russi mandano soldati e armi attraverso la frontiera.
The Russians also send soldiers and weapons across the border to help the people of Donbass, but can do little against the Ukrainian bomb. And President Poroshenko seems to have no problem bombing his own people.
Стреляли самый центр южных кварталов, где самое большое скопление людей.
Пожалуйста, посмотрите, что это. Это была моя квартира. Я несколько дней назад вывезла детей отсюда. Так бы мои дети погибли.
Которыми можно выразить все это негодование, весь этот страх, всю эту необъяснимость ситуации. Вот посмотрите. Это лицо нашего президента Порошенко. Не нашего, но президента Порошенко.
Мои дети до сих пор голят. Будь ты проклят, Порошенко. Жить уже нельзя так. Просто нельзя. Помогите. Кто это может? Помогите нам. Сколько можно?
Poi arrivano I neonazisti.
Soon after, the right-wing neo-Nazis arrive in Donbass to join the Azov battalion's ethnic cleansing.
Разом ми придушимо антидержавний заколот і відновимо територіальну цілісність нашої батьківщини. Слава Україні!
От з кожною оцією тряпкою буде отаке саме. Ми його знищимо, цю заразу.
Quello che fanno i neonazisti di Kiev alle
This is a November 2014 report by the United Nations on what's happening to the Russian-speaking population 6 months into the operations. The report says, serious human rights violations persist in eastern Ukraine despite tenuous ceasefire. Civilians have continued to be killed, unlawfully detained, tortured, and disappeared in eastern Ukraine. And the number of internally displaced people has risen considerably despite the announcement of a ceasefire on September 5th. According to the UN Human Rights Office, from mid-April to November 18th, at least 4,317 people were killed and 9,921 wounded in the conflict-affected area of eastern Ukraine. Serious human rights abuses by the armed groups continue to be reported, including torture, arbitrary and incommunicado detention, summary executions, forced labor, and sexual violence, as well as the destruction and illegal seizure of property.
Vi ricorda qualcosa?
Does this remind you of anything? Torture, mass executions, sexual violence? Those who accuse the Russians of these crimes today were the very ones who committed them against the Russians in Donbass back in 2014.
Però, quando queste cose le facevano gli ucraini, noi non ne abbiamo mai sentito parlare.
However, when it was the Ukrainians inflicting these things, nothing was reported by the media. Where were they? Sleeping, that's where they were. And who cares if Russian civilians die?
E a proposito di accusare...
And speaking of accusing others of the filth you do, look at this picture. This is a Ukrainian soldier preparing bombs to drop on Donbass. Look at what's written on the side of the bomb. Best wishes for your children. And these bombs are photographed before being dropped, not after they're found, so we know exactly who's dropping them.
A Donetsk c'è un cimitero apposito.
In Donetsk, there is a special cemetery called Alley of Angels, where over 250 children killed by Ukrainian bombs lie. Their ages, 6 to 9 years old.
E tutto questo non è finito nel 2014, ma è andato avanti fino ad oggi.
All this madness didn't end in 2014. It continues to this very day. And Zelensky's election did nothing to make life any easier for Russians living in Donbass. When he was elected president in May 2019, Zelensky made a promise to immediately end the war in Donbass. He made it perfectly clear during his first speech in parliament.
Найперше завдання – припинення вогню на Донбасі.
Poi però di mettere fine alla guerra non se ne è più parlato.
But that was the first and last time he ever mentioned it. Why? He, as president, is also commander-in-chief of the armed forces. A direct order from him would have stopped the bombings immediately. But that order never came. And who do you think prevented him from issuing that order?
Volete un'altra prova che Zelensky è...
Need more proof that Zelensky is only a puppet maneuvered by an occult puppeteer? To stop the war, all he had to do was implement the 2015 Minsk agreements, which attributed a special statute to the Donbass regions and would have created a 25-kilometer buffer zone between the Ukrainian territory and those of the separatists.
Questa fascia di sicurezza da sola avrebbe fermato immediatamente.
This alone would have stopped the shelling immediately. But Zelensky didn't want to implement those agreements. Why?
Siamo arrivati fino al febbraio di quest'anno, quando la crisi internazionale ormai stava diventando irreversibile e gli accordi non erano ancora...
It's now February 2022. The international crisis is becoming irreversible and the agreements haven't yet been respected. Macron manages to convince Putin and Zelensky to finally implement those agreements and stop the impending war. He announces it at a press conference in Kiev before the whole world. It's February 8th, 2022.
During these conversations, I've been able to get the very clear and explicit commitment of President Putin and President Zelensky to implement the Minsk agreements.
But surprisingly, the very next day, Zelensky goes back on his word.
Сегодня вечером официальный Киев заявил, что не намерен выполнять Минские соглашения и вести прямые переговоры с Донбассом. Произошло это спустя всего лишь 20 часов после совместной пресс-конференции Макрона и Зеленского, на которой утверждалось, что вот теперь-то Украина точно приступит к реализации договоренностей, от которых в прямом смысле зависит решение вопроса войны и мира.
This is the same guy who's running to every parliament in the world complaining that Russians are invading his country. This is the man responsible for reneging the Minsk agreements, which could have been implemented 2 months ago, or even 2 years ago, had he only wanted to.
Perché non lo ha mai fatto? Perché ha cambiato idea dalla sera alla mattina?
So why didn't he want to? Why did he change his mind overnight back in February? Perhaps someone wanted the war in Donbass to continue, leaving Putin with no option but to attack? Perhaps. We have no way of knowing this for sure. What we do know is that the Ukraine never respected the 2015 agreements, and the war against the people of Donbass continued till the day Putin decided to put an end to it. Let's now return to the NATO issue, the other reason why Putin claims to have attacked the Ukraine, that is, to prevent the Ukraine from joining NATO. Back in 2007, after the latest wave of annexations that led Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria to join, Putin declared at the World Security Conference, "NATO has put its frontline forces on our borders. This expansion represents a serious provocation that reduces the level of mutual trust, and we have the right to ask, against whom is this expansion intended? And what happened to the assurances our Western partners made after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact?"
Ovviamente nessuno ha mai risposto.
Of course, no one ever answered that question. And the race to complete the puzzle by attracting Ukraine to NATO began.
Ora, qui c'è da dire una cosa, perché io sento
At this point, a consideration is due. Quite often, we hear TV commentators saying it's not true that Ukraine was about to join NATO, and that this was just an excuse by Putin to invade and take over the country. So let's take a closer look at the historic events to see whether this is true or not. Let's return to 2014, where we left Yatsenyuk as the new prime minister right after the Nuland coup.
Non appena instaurato,
upon taking office, Yatsenyuk receives personal congratulations from John Kerry and U.S. Ambassador Pyatt, and from John McCain, the accidental tourist. Then, Yatsenyuk is greeted with honors by Ban Ki-moon at the United Nations, by David Cameron in England, by Angela Merkel in Germany, and then by the European Union.
Poi va alla Casa Bianca.
Then he goes to the White House, where he makes sure everyone knows which side Ukraine is on.
Probably in the nearest future, next week or in 10 days, Ukraine is to sign a political part of association agreement with the European Union, and we want to be very clear that Ukraine is and will be a part of the Western world.
Then Yatsenyuk invites NATO to visit him in Kiev and openly asks for aid and armaments to support the new government.
I passed an invitation to the North Atlantic Council to visit Kiev, and it would be great if you have a meeting in Kiev. We believe that we need to enhance our cooperation, and we would be grateful if we get some kind of additional support in technical support, humanitarian support, in improving Ukrainian defense and security system on the technical level. So this would help us to stabilize the situation and to maintain peace and stability in the region.
On August 29, 2014, Yatsenyuk announces that the Ukraine will ask to join NATO. On November 21st, the ruling coalition announces that NATO is their priority. On December 23rd, the Kiev parliament puts an end to Ukraine's state of non-alignment, a necessary step to undergo the NATO admission process. In March 2015, Poroshenko approves multilateral military exercises with NATO. Among these, Operation Fearless Guardian, with 2,200 soldiers including 1,000 Americans, Operation Seabreeze, with 1,000 American and 500 NATO troops, and Operation Rapid Trident, with 500 American and 600 NATO troops. On April 11th, the first NATO military convoy leaves Vicenza in Italy and arrives in Ukraine for Operation Fearless Guardian. In April 2016, Biden pledges $335 million in security aid to Poroshenko. These will be added to a $3 billion loan. In June 2017, the Rada, Kiev's parliament, passes a law that restores NATO membership as a priority for Ukrainian foreign policy. The law is signed by House Speaker Andrei Parubi and co-founder of the neo-Nazi party Svoboda, together with Ole Tjanibok. Andrei Parubi, whom we see here shaking hands with President of the Italian Parliamentary Chamber, the progressive Laura Boldrini, has been investigated for the Odessa massacre and has publicly praised Hitler on television, saying he was the greatest person to ever practice direct democracy. This was the president of the Ukrainian parliament under Poroshenko. Now let's return to our timeline. In July 2017, a month later, Poroshenko meets NATO Secretary Stoltenberg and officially asks that the NATO admission process be started. In September 2018, Poroshenko asks the parliament to amend the constitution in order to make it easier for Ukraine to join NATO. On February 7, 2019, Parliament approves the required changes to the Constitution and confirms Ukraine's intention to join NATO with a total of 334 out of 385 votes. On February 21st, the amendment to the Constitution, which allows the country to enter the EU and NATO, takes effect.
Nel maggio 2019, come abbiamo già detto,
in May 2019, as we already said, Zelensky wins the elections and takes Poroshenko's place, but continues on his predecessor's path. It immediately flies to Brussels to meet Stoltenberg, NATO secretary. In June 2020, NATO grants Ukraine the Enhanced Opportunity Partner status. In September 2020, President Zelensky approves a new national security strategy which calls for the development of a special partnership with NATO aiming at full membership. On March 24, 2021, Zelensky signs a presidential decree to implement the decision of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on the strategy of unemployment and reintegration of the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol.
Strategia di disoccupazione e reintegrazione del...
In lay terms, all this means taking back Crimea and Sevastopol militarily. In May 2021, U.S. Senator Chris Murphy visits Kiev and meets Zelensky. Then he announces that opening the doors to Ukraine will be the next logical step towards NATO membership. A month later, at the Brussels summit, NATO leaders reconfirmed the decision made in 2008 at the Bucharest summit by which Ukraine would join the alliance, with the membership plan being an integral part of the procedure. On June 28, 2021, Ukraine and NATO launch a joint military exercise in the Black Sea. On November 28, amidst accusation and counter-accusations, Moscow asks for legal guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. These guarantees, of course, never come. On November 30th, Putin officially draws the line when he declares that any new deployments of NATO forces and material to Ukraine would be crossing a red line for his country. He specifically highlighted concerns about the potential arrival of long-range hypersonic missiles with the ability to hit Moscow in 5 minutes. I hope that it would not get to that, Putin said, and common sense and responsibility for their own countries and the global community will eventually prevail. On December 1st, 2021, Putin officially asks for guarantees that NATO will not expand eastward.
Ma gli Stati Uniti rispondono che per l'Ucraina le porte sono sempre aperte.
But the United States replied that the doors are always open for Ukraine. On December 23rd, at a press conference, Putin again stresses that further eastward expansion of NATO is unacceptable, and once again explains his reasons.
We have made it clear that any further NATO movement to the east is unacceptable. There is nothing unclear about this. We are not deploying our missiles over at the borders of the US. No. On the other hand, the US is deploying its missiles close to our home, on the porch of our house. So, are we demanding something excessive? We're simply asking them not to deploy their attack systems over at our home. What is so unusual or peculiar about that?
Ma gli Stati Uniti fanno finta di non
But
sentire.
once again, the U.S. lends a deaf ear. On January 31st, 2022, at the United Nations, the Russian ambassador publicly accuses the United States of fomenting tensions and provoking Russia, as if starting a war were their hidden agenda.
Western colleagues are talking about the need for de-escalation. However, first and foremost, they themselves are whipping up tensions and rhetoric and are provoking escalation. The discussions about a threat of war is provocative in and of itself. You are almost calling for this. You want it to happen. You're waiting for it to happen, as if you want to make your words become a reality.
Ma gli Stati Uniti continuano a fare.
And again, the U.S. doesn't reply. On February 8th, Putin, with a clearly irritated tone of voice, issues a final warning to Western media.
Я хочу еще раз все-таки подчеркнуть это. Я говорил, но мне очень бы хотелось, чтобы вы меня услышали все-таки в конце концов. И донесли это до своих читателей, зрителей и пользователей в интернете. Но вы понимаете или нет, что если Украина будет в НАТО и военным путем будет возвращать себе Крым, европейские страны автоматически будут втянуты в военный конфликт с Россией. Победителей не будет. И вы окажетесь втянутыми в этот конфликт помимо своей воли.
Russia makes a final official request to the United States to put in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO and that it will not host NATO ballistic weapons. The answer, or rather, a final slap in the face, comes directly from the American Secretary of State Blinken.
From our perspective, I can't be more clear. NATO's door is open, remains open, and that is our commitment.
A questo punto Putin rimane senza opzioni. L'unico modo per evitare che l'Ucraina entri nella NATO e che le piazzi i missili lungo i confini è quello di invaderla militarmente.
At this point, Putin is left with no other option. The only way to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and placing missiles along its borders is to invade it militarily.
Cuba, se i russi non li avessero ritirati.
Just like Kennedy, whose only way to keep Russian missiles away would have been to invade Cuba. Why was Kennedy's logic justified while Putin's is not?
Fra l'altro, quello che Putin va chiedendo da anni, ovvero...
After all, what Putin has been asking for these past years, namely that the Ukraine not join NATO, is exactly what Zelensky conceded after the beginning of the war. On several occasions, Zelensky publicly stated, "We must accept the fact that for us to join NATO is out of the question." Let's think about this. Had he fulfilled his promise, that is, had Russia been granted what it asked for up until mid-February, this war would probably never have started. But the U.S. categorically refused to give this guarantee, and it did it in a very provocative way. So who is it that really had an interest in Putin attacking? Was it Putin, or was it the United States?
E infatti, guarda caso, i veri vincitori in tutta...
And is it mere coincidence that the real winner in this whole affair is the United States? Ukraine was used as bait. Zelensky fell for it with both feet. And now Ukrainians are dying under the bombs. In the meantime, thanks to the invasion, the Americans were able to A, isolate Russia from Europe once and for all, something they've been dying to do for the longest time, and B, unleash anti-Russian sentiment throughout the world, criminalizing Putin to the point that any and every form of economic, political, or mediatic sanction or censorship becomes feasible and possible. The neocon strategy to the letter: isolate the Russians, surround them, provoke them, and when they react, punish them with the worst possible sanctions. A win-win situation on all fronts. This is where we stop. Everyone, of course, is free to draw his or her own conclusions, but at least now we have all the historical facts, and not just the half-truth that our media wants us to know.
Vorrei concludere con una citazione di...
Let's end with a quote by Otto von Bismarck, the German 19th century chancellor who knew Russians quite well. "I know 100 ways to pull the Russian bear from its den, but not one to pull him back. Do not tease the Russian bear."
Ecco, oggi noi siamo in questa situazione.
This is exactly what's happening now. He was surrounded, he was teased, he was provoked. Now the bear is out of its den, and we have to deal with it.
Quindi adesso mi raccomando, rimettiamoci tutti lì a discutere sull'ultimo razzo caduto.
Now let's all return to our daily discussions about the crash rocket, whether it came from the north or the south. Let's all go back to gazing at the bloody teddy bear, the corpses in the streets, and the demolished houses. And most of all, let's keep saying what a nasty dictator this Putin guy is, without ever doing any serious historical analysis. We Europeans always make these analyses when it's too late. Maybe 2 years down the road, when we're paying for all our mistakes and we're in a serious economic crisis, maybe then, only then, will we begin to truly analyze what happened. 2 years from now, we'll all have new governments, and the new leaders will say, had we evaluated our options better, we could have avoided certain mistakes. But what's keeping us from making that analysis now? Absolutely nothing. It's probably just laziness. The laziness to admit we messed up. That's all. Pride, laziness, or maybe cowardice. The fear to face the U.S.'s wrath. So we're condemning ourselves to a future far worse than it could have been for all of us. Not to mention the fact that if we continue sending weapons to Ukraine, we could ourselves become the direct target of a larger war. Have a good trip around the sun, Giulietto Chiesa would say.